Anthropology, and I have a master's degree in nutritional sciences. And I sit in the Department of International Health in the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. Dr. Itsuko was good friends with one of my former mentors, Dr. Carl Taylor. And I knew Dr. Taylor when I first arrived at Hopkins.
It was more than 30 some years ago.
Yes, I first arrived at Johns Hopkins more than about 36 years ago. And I knew him then, and he was a friend and a very good man. Um, so the focus of my work has been on chronic disease prevention, especially amongst disadvantaged populations and communities. And I'll share some of those experiences with you today. And I thought that what I would do is I would talk about the topic of formative research and this idea, and I'll define what I mean by formative research in a little bit. But when I first arrived at Johns Hopkins 36 years ago, I was very unprepared to do the kinds of work that I wanted to do. I did not have much interventional or programmatic experience at all. I had studied a lot of books, and I had spent some good time in different countries, and including Nepal, doing my dissertation research, but I had not really thought about or had much experience in programs. And so that's one of the main things I learned. And one of the things that I learned how to do was how to utilize what skills I did have at the time, which were what I would call formative research skills. So the title of my talk is Working with Different Cultures, Formative Research for Public Health Nutrition and Program Design. And I'm going to start off with a very basic piece. What do we mean by culture? Because there are very different definitions of it and how we use it. I'll talk a little bit about what I mean by formative research, and then some of the uses of formative research. And then I'm going to give two examples of formative research, and these include, let's see, some work that I'm doing in Baltimore, of a project called Baltimore Healthy Stores, and then some work that I do in the Canadian Arctic, or have done in the Canadian Arctic. So let's start off by what is culture? And this is not an easy question to answer. I will have to say that. So essentially, what I would say in general terms is that culture is the body of knowledge, values, ideas, and approaches that characterize a particular group of people. This body of knowledge, this information provides guidelines for behavior and for perceptions. It creates the rules for how you should behave. And it's very broad. It covers many different things. It includes health. It includes economics. It includes religion. It includes kinship. It includes everything around what people do, which we sometimes refer to as the context. So anthropologists, like I was formerly trained to be, were very interested in describing human culture in different settings and addressing particular problems. Some other features of culture. Okay, I see what it's doing. Some characteristics of culture. Some things to remember, that culture is something you learn as a child and you pass on to your children, right? This is a process, what we call enculturation. So it's something we learn and we pass it on to future generations. It's something that we share with a group of people. We share if the members of your group share your culture with you, and it's embodied in language. How people talk and the words that they use represents what's important in that culture. So as I mentioned before, I did my doctoral dissertation research in Nepal. I learned some of the Nepali language at that time. And in Nepali, if you say your brother, there's two words for brother, dai, and bai. And bai refers to my younger brother, and Dai refers to my older brother. And those two terms, it's significant that Nepali has these different terms for younger brother versus older brother, because my older brother has power and responsibility for me, and I have power and responsibility over my younger brother or sister. So these the language tells you a lot about what's important in a culture. Culture is also symbolic. So things mean different things. So I could show you a bottle of Coca-Cola, and you might say, well, that just means he likes soda pop. But you could also say, well, that made me mean something about him or what he's trying to say about his values, and it means something different. If I sit down to a meal of lobster in the United States, that's a sign that I have wealth. But in other places that I've been, lobster is very readily available, and it's not a particular sign of wealth at all. So culture decides on things that are symbolic. Culture tends to be patterned or systematic. So there's relationships between things, and if you understand that patterning and those relationships, you can get a lot of ideas about how possibly to begin developing or designing programs or policies that would work in different settings. Culture also determines what is salient, what is important, what is valued. There's always a lot of different things that could be selected as important, but what is really important? What do people value? What makes sense to them? Culture helps determine that. One of the things that when we're studying or working in a new culture that we look for is what we call core cultural values. So within every cultural setting, there are multiple values that reflect things that people value particular in that particular location or setting. So in the United States, one cultural value is individualism, the importance of the individual. I if I value individualism, then I value my own ability to make my own decisions, to be responsible for my own health. If you're trying to do a public health announcement to some in a cultural setting which values individualism, you're going to direct that at here's what you should do for yourself, right? But that's a very different core cultural value than, say, collectivism, which is about the importance of the family, of the community, of the group. And so different cultures have different core cultural values. So this is a dimension that you might consider individualism versus collectivism. I am not very familiar with Japan, but I did look it up, and I saw that that was mentioned is that a core cultural value is, you can pronounce it better, wa, the harmony, the idea that social harmony is very important, and it's important to avoid conflict and to not cause inconvenience to others. And it made me reflect when I looked this up because I've been on several. I was on the bullet train, and I was on various forms of public transportation, and very often there would be announcements about the importance of being nice to your fellow passengers, keeping in harmony. Don't upset people in how you behave in English. So I can imagine that it was also happening in Japanese, but I heard the English. So even they will say that to the people who speak only English. So you have to figure out what the core cultural values are in a particular setting, and that's a first step to being able to understand a cultural setting and to be able to work and develop programs, policies, and other interventions. Now, I will say, I've just made it sound very simple. You go into a cultural setting, you identify the top core cultural values, you're in. It's not that simple. It's not that simple because there's variability and variation. Dr. Etsuko was talking about how she is of a different culture than some of you, because she's saying that's by maybe by age group, or she was referring to, or something. There's variation within settings in terms of the culture. And very often, younger people will be somewhat different culturally than older people. This happens a lot in my country with Native Americans. In Native American cultures and communities, very often the older people, the elders, will speak the traditional language. But the children, unfortunately, have lost that and will not and do not learn the traditional language. And they don't learn a lot of the core cultural values that go with that. And so here you have, often in the same household, two or three different cultures living in the same household with very different value systems. So there's variation by age. And the fact is that cultures and cultural groups change over time. So one of the purposes of formative research is to engage with communities to understand their culture and to understand that variation and to understand how that might affect the kinds of programs or interventions that you might develop as a public health person. Here's some guiding principles of how we try to work with a cultural group or in a different cultural setting. The first thing is respect. It's very important to realize that everybody's culture has its own unique values and its own system. And just because it's different from yours doesn't mean it's wrong. So you have to respect the fact that our own culture, our own ways, our own knowledge is not superior to another culture. And that, in fact, they are equal in many ways. And so we have to respect other cultures. We have to abide by the principle of co-learning. So it's not just us passing information, teaching, educating, improving that other culture. It's about we have to acknowledge that we have at least as much to learn through this interaction as the people that we are working with. So we call this co-learning, and I'll say more about that in a moment. Understanding is really important. We need to understand core cultural values, as I've already said, and other features of cultural systems in order to be able to communicate with people. Otherwise, we're talking one language, literally, even if we're speaking the same language, English or Japanese or whatever, we're talking different in different ways because we're using different terms and a different value system. Salience. We need to provide information in a manner that is consistent with those values. And when it is consistent with those values, it should resonate. And so this term resonate means it vibrates. I don't know if there's a good word in Japanese for this. Probably there is, but it's like a tone. If you say something the right way, people will go, oh yeah, that makes sense. Like, right? Versus if you say something in a way that people do not understand, then they go, what? What? Maybe those of you who have done education in community settings or to have had that experience of not being able to communicate with someone because they operate from a different cultural perspective. Another thing we need to think about is the importance of capacity building. Our job is not just to go there and do our program. Ideally, our job is to go there, work with people to do the programs, and leave the place better and able to function without us, right? Especially if we're talking about working in some other setting. So a primary goal is to build capacity. So I'm going to present a really complicated picture here, but this is a picture of it's essentially a system for thinking about how to design an intervention program. I mostly focus on nutrition related programs because that's my field, but it's valuable if we're talking about leprosy programs or if we're talking about some other thing that you might be interested in. At the beginning is what are your guiding principles and what theory are you using? That's that little bar on the left-hand side. Out of that, there's three things that we typically do. We do formative research. I'm going to define what that is in a moment. We do formative research. We do some form of community engagement. We don't just drop in with an intervention program. We talk to people, we plan it out, we figure out how to work this out. And we also do some literature. We look at the written published literature, and all three of those sorts of information are what goes into developing a program. I'm going to talk about nutrition related programs and projects. I'll talk a lot about food, but again, the general concepts is relevant for other settings. Should get rid of that. So out of all of these different sources of information comes these core cultural values. And out of this comes things like we might be able to identify key physical activity related behaviors, key food related behaviors, and the foods we want to promote. Okay, again, I'm a nutrition person, so I'm all about the food, right? So, and then what messages we might develop, and then the core cultural values tie into those messages. So the messages are think about what we say to people. In nutrition, we often think in terms of eat this food, don't eat that food, right? So we often think about this food's good for you, this food's bad for you, and maybe we explain why this food is good for you and this food is bad for you. Maybe we say this food's going to make you obese. This food will keep you from getting obese. But if it's a cultural setting where obesity is not a concern, where actually a heavier body size is valued and is considered culturally appropriate, then you've probably not communicated well this notion. You understood or learned how to make things salient. All of these different kinds of information feed into things like your decision about where are you going to do this kind of program, the venue. Is it going to be in the home through home visits? Is it going to be in the food store? Will it be at the health clinic? Will it be through schools? If you're focusing on childhood obesity, maybe you're going to do something at schools. Will it be in restaurants? Will it be in parks? There are all these different venues that you would potentially make some decisions about where you might intervene. This leads into two different types of intervention strategies. The first is educational and social strategies. So that's the content, what it is that you're presenting. Maybe you're going to present it in the form of stories, maybe in the form of songs, maybe in the form of some metaphors for communication. How are you going to present that? What's the media you're going to use? Will it be flip charts, posters, social media, street dramas, videos, telenovelas, talking circles, and many, many more strategies for doing this and what might be effective in a different setting? And maybe you're going to use role models or peers, peer mentors. Maybe that's this one aspect of the strategy. So there's a cluster of strategies that are about education, about social relationships and interrelationships. The other cluster of interventions are more environmental or structural. It's changing perhaps what we call the choice architecture. So if we're talking about someone going to a food store, we can make that food store lead people to the healthy foods and away from the unhealthy foods. We can take away the unhealthy foods from the cash registers. We can put the healthy foods at the cash registers or maybe at the end caps. We can put the healthier foods at eye level where they're more likely to be seen and put the unhealthy foods way at the bottom or at the top where they're less likely to be seen. A lot of things you can do by just changing the physical location of things, what we call the choice architecture. But we can also implement things that reduce or increase options, and often this is done through policy. So an example of this is something called a staple foods ordinance. In the United States, in a couple of cities, they've tested staple foods ordinances where they require all food stores, including very small corner stores, to stock a broader array of healthy foods and a certain depth of stock. So I'm going to make an attempt to get this off the screen because that should. The problem is just it doesn't want to go anywhere. Doesn't. Oh, that's better. Okay. And on the once you've decided what the intervention is going or program is going to look like, you need to put it all together. And you don't just do everything all at once necessarily. You might do things in a certain sequence or order. So you plan it out. So I actually teach a course where this is the main structure of the entire course, where we spend one day on formative research, another day on community engagement, another day on core cultural values and messaging, another day on selecting foods and behaviors, another on venue selection. So we spend entire 2-hour class sessions on each of these topics, and I just did it in 5 minutes, which is probably not the best thing, but at least you get an idea of a strategy by which you might bring cultural information into design of public health or nutrition related interventions. So let's talk about the formative research. And you remember there was this box of formative research. And what do I mean by formative research? What is it? Formative research is information gathering that precedes structured data collection and implementation of interventions. So it's the stuff you do before you design the program. It's the stuff you do to help you design the program or the policy or whatever it is going, the curriculum for school or whatever. So we use it to develop culturally appropriate interventions. We also use it to design our data collection instruments because very often the evaluation that we're going to do requires specialized ways of asking questions. And it's especially useful, formative research is especially useful when we're talking about changing human behavior. Very useful for that. And it's usually part of I use this as a class slide, so it's referring to class on Monday. Don't worry about that. You won't have to come back on Monday. But it's usually part of what we call a participatory approach to learning and engaging with communities. So formative research usually combines qualitative and quantitative. If I say qualitative, and quantitative, do you understand the distinction between qualitative and quantitative? You probably have that a little bit. Actually, if you guys are all interested in nursing, nursing programs, especially in the United States, emphasize qualitative research very heavily as well as quantitative research. Qualitative research, especially in the tradition called phenomenology, is very heavily emphasized amongst nurses and nursing schools and so forth. But essentially, qualitative research is data in the form of words. Quantitative research is data in the form of numbers. And that's a very gross simplification because there's a lot more that goes on that differentiates those. But formative research typically uses both approaches. And it's usually multi-stage and iterative. So when we do formative research, we don't just send someone out to do it and then they come back and we're done. What we do is we think about it in at least 3 stages. Exploratory. Let's say we're interested in diabetes in Native Americans in the United States. What do people think about health, diet, and foods they should eat? What do people think about being physically active? What do people think about diabetes or obesity or any of these terms? So we would begin to explore those concepts in a first stage, very open-ended. Then out of that early formative research usually comes a series of ideas for how we might proceed with intervention. Let's say in the early stages of our formative research, we hear that people listen to the radio a lot. And in fact, we're listening to the radio, and on the radio, we're hearing a lot of experiences that people are having, and announcements are made about the community and these sorts of things. So we realize that, well, maybe people are listening to the radio all the time, and maybe that would make a lot of sense to have some kind of promotion that takes place on the radio. So that's a possibility to consider. And so we might, in stage 2, explore the radio as an intervention approach and talk to people about their radio use. And maybe these days it's probably social media or some digital type of thing. So we would try to understand people's use of social media and what they use it for. And then maybe for the 3rd stage, we would develop some types of interventions or intervention materials, and we would test this. We might show it to a focus group or several focus groups of people to get their responses. Oops. I personally believe that formative research is quite essential if you want to bring culture into your program development. You're interested in finding out, what do people do now? And are some people doing what you want them to do? Some may be. This happens a lot. We want people to eat healthy. And it's not just that nobody eats healthy. Sometimes there are a few people who eat healthy, or there are some people who are physically active. These are often called positive deviants or positive role models or something like that. And if there are people who are already doing these behaviors, this tells you something about the behavior, which is that it's doable. In other words, sometimes certain things we ask people to do are, for some reason or another, not doable. Maybe it costs too much money to get that gym membership. Maybe to eat those specific healthy foods that you're promoting, it just costs too much. It would increase their food budget by 50%. It's just not viable. But if some people are already doing it who are of similar economic circumstances, then you have an argument to make that for positive deviance, that those particular people are it could be potential role models. What do people think about your topic? Is it important to them? What do people think it's important? I already said in Native American context, obesity is not important. Um, I've gone to many public presentations where I've used the word without even thinking about it, obesity, and then some people, what's obesity? Like that's one of the first questions I get. And that's a very and then even when I explain, sometimes especially older people will say, well, it's healthy to be bigger. Um, you need some weight on you because that's what a healthy body size looks like. On the other hand, diabetes is very important in Native communities because everybody sees somebody who has lost a limb to amputation, right? Who potentially is on dialysis. And so that's an example of a very salient chronic disease as opposed to obesity, which is not very salient. So what do people think about your topic? What's important to them? What are their core cultural values? We've already talked about that. How do you communicate with people? Um, what kinds of messaging do you do? What kinds of channels? And how do you create persuasive messages that will convince people to try something? In nutrition circles, we think, oh, if we just say, eat this food because it's healthy, it will protect your heart. Don't eat that food because it's unhealthy, it will give you a heart attack. We think that that's a convincing way to present information to people. This maybe you call it a scare tactic. And in some contexts, yes, negative messaging can be effective in some cases, but it's not always effective. And we need to really think about how to create persuasive messaging. So a good formative research study helps you prioritize. It helps you understand what the key behavior should be, what the food should be for promotion. It helps you decide what's salient, what resonates with people, what's important. It helps you define. So when we say audience segmentation, what we're saying is in any cultural setting, there will be different groups of people and subgroups of people. And the messaging, the communication, the intervention that you might try for one group of people is probably different than the other group of people. In the Native American context, what you would do for elders, for older people, is going to be very different than what you do for young people or children. So you need to think about audience segmentation. You might think about identifying existing stories or modes of communication or narration that could serve as role models for behavior. We need to understand the context. We need to understand, well, why is it that this behavior does or does not occur? What are the factors that affect that behavior in one way or the other? We need to get people's reactions through focus groups, perhaps, to intervention materials and strategies. And we need to begin getting information on sustainability, how to sustain the program through institutions. We need to think about that actually from the very beginning. Um, if you're trying to reduce childhood obesity and maybe you're going to do something with schools, think about how you're going to get the school board on your side to adopt that health curriculum that you've been developing to make it a permanent part of the curriculum and not just rely on the goodwill of teachers, but to have the school board voted in and saying, this is now the curriculum that we're going to use, could be very important. There are all sorts of things that you would study if you were doing formative research in this area. I'm just going to run through about 4 slides, which it's going to be a list. And I don't want you to memorize this, and we're not going to go into each one, but you can think about, well, you need to understand the people. Who are the caregivers? Who are the food preparers? Who are the change agents in the household? Like who does new things? Who's bringing in new ideas and in the community? You need to understand where foods are available. Again, this is very nutrition related, in stores, in markets, in food pantries. What are different components that should say not build of the built food environment? Who are the producers, the distributors, the retailers, food pantries? I should involve, there's probably digital, I'll come to that in a second. What are the policies that affect the foods that people eat in that setting? And a few of these I've mentioned. These days, we have to really be concerned about the digital environment. Social media, food delivery apps, and so forth are very influential, especially of children. So children, I don't know about Japan, but in the US, children will spend 6 or more hours a day on various forms on screens. And very high proportion of that is social media. I know they're not supposed to, but they do. And they are deeply influenced. And in fact, there are the term influencer, there are people who are a kind of role model, often for children, but for other people on social media, and have deep and abiding influence, um, uh, something we call parasocial relationships with children or with anybody, in fact, where you feel like you know that person, that influencer. You want to be like that person, and you eat those foods. You use the makeup products that that person uses. We try those drinks that, oh, so and so thought that was delicious, said it was delicious. I'm going to try that. Very influential and very niche oriented. A lot of influencers are what we call micro or meso influencers. They have followings of 10,000 to 100,000 people, but they appeal to high school girls in Japan, in this part of Japan, and they will appeal to a very small but niche audience. And they can be incredibly effective, for better or for worse, in communicating with them. So we do need to understand the digital environment as well as the built environment. Other things we want to study as part of the formative research are what people think or how they think, their knowledge, and this includes not only their knowledge in terms of what we consider knowledge as nutrition people, but also their local knowledge, their traditional knowledge, self-efficacy, intentions, what makes a meal. Um, uh, all of these are potentially important aspects of the cultural setting and the mental or cognitive aspects of this cultural setting. There's behaviors. This includes use of media, including digital media, as I've mentioned, the selection of foods, what foods people eat, how much different foods contribute to the diet, how they're stored, methods of preparation, how food is allocated or served. Um, if we were interested in sodium intake, hypertension is a big issue in Japan, as it is in many other countries, including my own. There would be a lot of things we would want to understand to explore if we wanted to understand people's exposure to sodium. We would want to know things like, well, the types of soy sauce that were consumed. We'd want to know the broth, how that broth was made, if that they bought at the ramen shop. And I heard, much to my horror, because I had just eaten a big bowl of ramen, how much she said, well, that was probably as much sodium as more than, like 2 grams of sodium in that bowl of ramen that you just consumed. And I was slightly horrified with myself. Okay. So these are some of the things you need to understand. And how food is consumed. Are people served? Are they encouraged to eat? And so forth. How does child care behavior take place if we're interested in child care in terms of feeding patterns and so forth? How about health-seeking behaviors? What do we do to encourage, or how do people go about seeking health care? Who do they go to first? In most settings, we have sort of what I would call medical pluralism. We have multiple forms of healthcare available. I'm guessing here in Japan, you also have medical pluralism. You probably have what we might call allopathic or biomedicine, but you probably also have some variation on herbal treatments and traditional Chinese medicine, and maybe there's some spiritual aspects as well involved for some people. So anyways, there's quite a diversity of potential differences in health-seeking behaviors, and that's also potentially part of what you would explore in formative research. We want to understand social relationships and social support and how those exist or how they don't exist and how they could be strengthened. Oops. Well, this is just an example of some different forms of data collection that you might do to help you as part of that formative research. And I just said, well, if you're planning a nutrition intervention or a food-related intervention, you might do in-depth interviews on all of these different topics. You might do observations on how people serve food or prepare food or acquire food. You might do structured observations, that's like counting, of the food environment. What are the different food sources? What's on the menu? Do they offer children's sizes? Do they offer a low sodium version? Do they offer a sugar-free version of those various drinks? Focus groups to review draft materials and intervention strategies, and dietary recalls to help you understand which foods would be most important to focus on. So now I'm going to go and talk about two case examples. So you get sort of an idea of how formative research fed into the development of a couple of programs. And the first one I want to talk about is Baltimore Healthy Stores. And this was actually one of the first urban food store-based intervention programs in the US that I'm aware of. And its overall goal was to improve diet quality and reduce diet-related risk factors in low-income. AA stands for African American. Sorry, that's a common abbreviation we use. And we worked with low, large, and small food stores in Baltimore. And we tried to increase the availability and access to healthy foods at the point of purchase. So just so you figure out where we're talking about, so there's the United States, and Baltimore is in the upper or mid-right in red. It's about, half an hour to an hour's drive from Washington, D.C., depending on the traffic. I don't know why I did that. Oops. Oh. So I keep clicking in this left-hand corner. There you go. So many people think about Baltimore. Katie knows the reality, and think, oh, it's this beautiful inner harbor. This is what the tourist maps and everything emphasize. Unfortunately, yes, this does exist, but unfortunately, large parts of the city look like this, and are vacant and abandoned housing. Settings where there's high crime rates, a lot of drug use, a lot of challenges in these parts of the city. And in those parts of the city are often these setting areas in pink, which we call healthy food priority areas. And about a quarter of the residents of Baltimore live in healthy food priority areas. These are places with low healthy food availability. The distance to a supermarket is more than a quarter of a mile. Most people don't have their own vehicles. Most people live at less than 185% of poverty level. So poor people without access to supermarkets. Now, this low access to healthy foods in terms of availability, price, and location has sometimes been referred to as a food desert. Actually, I don't like that term so much because what's actually true is that there's a lot of food available in the form of what you can buy at small retail corner stores and at carry-out restaurants, all mostly independently owned. And so, but it's mostly unhealthy food. And we commonly refer to these nowadays as food swamps. Still, there are crime and safety issues. There are also cultural challenges as well. If you look at, there's 633 corner stores in Baltimore City, and these are some pictures of some of them. And about a quarter of them are like this, what we call behind the glass, which means you put your money right there, say, I want a box of Fruit Loops. They rotate it, take your money, and put the Fruit Loops in there and rotate it back to you. So a lot of what we talk about in nutrition is we're going to teach about label reading and that sort of thing. You can't read a label if it's you don't in those behind the glass stores. You do not have access to the food to be able to read those labels, even if if there was a healthier choice there, which typically there is not, you would not be able to identify that choice. So our specific aims of this particular project, and this was one of the very first projects that we did, was to develop culturally appropriate program for corner stores in Baltimore aimed at increasing stocking and promotion of healthy foods, to explore key features of corner stores in Baltimore, and to assess feasibility of this program. What was our initial approach? We worked with small food retailers, corner stores, and there's a lot of advantages in working with small retailers. First of all, they're already there. There are hundreds of them. There are 600 corner stores in Baltimore. They already operate in the low-income areas in the city. They tend to be open 5 to 7 days a week, 12 hours or more a day. And they're typically visited already daily by many community members, sometimes more than once a day. So I'm going to really cut short the formative research here, but we did a lot of interviewing and observation. And this was some of the key issues that came out that I want to emphasize to you. So when we would talk to the store customers, and by the way, the store customers were predominantly African American, they would say, I would love to eat healthy foods, but they are too expensive. They're not available in the local small stores that I shop in, or they are of poor quality in the stores that I shop in. But they expressed a lot of consumer demand for those foods. So the natural thing to do was then to talk to the store owners themselves. And we did. And the store owners then said, I would love to stock healthy foods, but nobody buys them. Or the last time I stocked, and you can fill in the blank, low fat milk, whole wheat bread, whatever, it just sat on the shelves. It went bad. I lost money. I'll never buy that product again or sell that product in my store again. So they have very low perceived consumer demand and high perceived risk. So a big issue here is this difference in understanding between the predominantly African American consumers and the predominantly, in this case, Korean American store owners. Really big difference. Other formative data, here's some quantitative data. We did dietary recalls, and we found out about 10% of the total energy came from soda. About 12% of the total fat came from chicken. About 34% of the total sugar consumed came from soda. So here you can begin to identify, well, what should be the target foods? Looks like soda. That's something, if you're going to, you can't change everything that people eat or we're going to do, but if you could affect soda alone, let's say, okay, this is a bit of a dream, but what if you were to get everybody who drank soda to drink water or diet soda or something like that? You would reduce the caloric intake by 10%. That 10% in a 3,000 calorie diet is about 300 calories. That's enough to see in and of itself a substantial weight loss and probably a substantial reduction in diabetes and a lot of the other diet-related chronic diseases just from the soda alone. So, but this was an example of another piece of formative research. We also did community workshops, and the community workshops were aimed at getting community members engaged and getting their ideas about how to proceed with the program, with the intervention. We also used behavior change theory. We used social cognitive theory, and I won't go into the details here, but what we saw was that this was the store-based intervention needed to focus and to work with different groups. And so we developed a intervention where we would work in 7 corner stores in East Baltimore, 6 corner stores in West Baltimore, and we introduced healthier foods and we promoted them at the point of purchase. This gives you an idea of what the phases of the intervention program looked like. And a really big underlying issue, a cultural issue, was the fact that the Korean American immigrants were the people who owned the majority of the small corner stores. And at the time that I did this study, they owned about 70% of the small corner stores. Nowadays, it's reduced. There are other immigrant populations who have taken over, but they're still probably around 40%. And but since 1970 and into like the early 2000s and into maybe 2010, 2015, most of the small store owners in Baltimore were Korean American, and their customers were mostly low-income African Americans, and they relied on these small corner stores. There's been a history of difficult relationships between Korean store owners and African American clientele and others. It's language barriers, it's cultural differences and misunderstanding, it's gaps in political politics and economic politics. And so in order for this project to be successful, we could not just try to convince the store owners to stock healthier food. We had to deal somehow with this cultural issue, right? Because if we didn't deal with this cultural issue, we could see what was going to happen. Nothing would happen, right? No matter what we did, it wouldn't be effective. So we developed intervention strategies that targeted the Korean American store owners as well as the African American customers. And these are some of the ideas. Incentive for the store. I'm going to focus mainly on the store owners, incentives, cultural guidelines, and nutrition education, and the customers, which included a variety of different things as well. I'll show examples of these different things, but I'm going to focus especially on the store owners. So the intervention for store owners focused on cultural guidelines. Um, so I think this is somewhat true, at least in Japan as well. But Korea culture tends to be what we would call low physical contact. When you see someone, say, "Hey, how are you? Give me a big hug." African American culture tends to be high physical contact. When an African American customer comes into a Korean grocery store and gets their change, the change is put onto a little thing and no touch. Perfectly acceptable in Korean culture. I believe it's perfectly acceptable in Japanese culture because I see it in every store that I go into in Japan as well. But in Baltimore, this is a insulting thing. You're saying you do not want to touch me. You're saying I'm dirty. You're saying I carry disease or like it creates all of these things. Also, low communication, especially if you think about those behind the glass stores. Can you imagine that's a big barrier for communication. So a lot of it was cultural guidelines for the store owners. Make eye contact and small talk. Do not put change on the counter, put it back in the customer's hand, hire workers from the community. So there were a lot of things like this that we communicated to them that were important. Other things for the store owners, we provided suggestions on how to select healthier foods. This included whatever foods you do purchase that would be promoted, make sure they're at the same price or lower than their less healthy alternatives. So make sure that if you sell low-fat milk, it's at the same cost or less as regular whole milk. Make sure if you sell whole wheat bread that it's at the same price or less than white bread or whatever type of bread you're selling. Mm. Other parts of the intervention, gift cards, promoted foods, gift cards to go to their wholesaler to buy a starter stock of some of the healthier foods. We provided nutrition education in Korean for the Korean American store owners. For the customers, posters, educational displays, shelf labeling. We did taste tests as well. I think I don't have a slide about that. And we worked on getting those healthier foods stocked that weren't normally stocked at baseline. Quite a variety of healthy foods were not available at baseline at corner stores. And interestingly, the store owners said, well, we don't have those foods because no one asked for them, right? If people ask, this is not just true of Baltimore. There's almost every other setting that I've worked in. The store owners will say that I will stock it if the customers ask for it. And so that provides an opportunity, right, to encourage customers can convey their desires so that the store owners will stock those foods. This looks at some of the foods that were promoted and changes in stocking of those foods. You can see it varied from food to food. But if you look at it, a few of these foods, what you can see is in the interventions stores, as opposed to the comparison stores, over the course of the project, there was significant increases in particular foods in intervention stores and stocking and sales of those foods. And in addition, when we looked at consumer results, we saw that among 85 consumers that we were able to measure pre and post, after adjustments, we saw a significant impact on food preparation methods and frequency of purchase of promoted foods, and a trend for improvement in healthy food intentions. So in summary, what we saw in this particular small trial was that intervention stores improved the availability of promoted foods. They increased their sales of some of their promoted foods. They showed higher self-efficacy for stocking some of the promoted foods. And improved stocking was associated with increased sales of those foods, which is all a good thing. So it was feasible. This was our very first trial in Baltimore, kind of a small scale thing. Now I'm going to take you to someplace entirely different. So I'm going to take you to the Canadian Arctic. So can you see it? What you should imagine now is like someone dropped a cube of ice down the back of your shirt or something like that. Very cool. This was a project called Healthy Foods North. So here is Canada. Here's the state of Nunavut within Canada. And you can see it's in the Arctic region. The Inuit people still have relatively high access to a lot of their traditional harvested foods. This is a caribou. So they will hunt caribou. Some will hunt whale. They'll hunt walrus, seal, different kinds of species of fish, poultry, ducks, geese. Some in season during the summer, certain kinds of berries will become available and so forth. But they also use a local food store, and this is the northern store, which is the main store that exists in all of these different communities. And unfortunately, you may recognize Kentucky Fried Chicken. I don't know if Pizza Hut is a thing around here or not. Okay. So unfortunately, and this was like 15 years ago, those chains have penetrated even to the remote Arctic communities. And if you go inside these stores, you'll see lots of preserved meats. This is just a lot of unhealthy food. So what I wanted to do is describe to you the process by which we use to develop this intervention program called Healthy Foods North. Oops, somehow I skipped it. How do I don't know how to make it go backwards. Oh, wait, this will work. Yeah, that worked. Okay, so we did formative research, we did community workshops, went through a process of developing the intervention. And I'm going to talk about especially this first part here, the formative research and the community workshops, and then a little bit about what the intervention looked like. So here are some of the questions we tried to answer with our formative research. What are the core values community members have about food? How do people get food? What food sources are preferred and why? How do local stores make decisions about the foods they stock? What types of promotions work in those stores? What intervention ideas are recommended or supported by community members, community leaders, store managers, and health staff? And this gives you an idea. We worked in Cambridge Bay, Toloyok, Inuvik, and Toktoyotok. Oops, I did it again. Did it again. Stop. And these are the numbers of interviews that we did of each type of person in each setting. So you can see we did in Cambridge Bay, we did quite a lot of interviews, next most in Toloyok, next 11 in Inuvik, and 6 in Tuktoyaktuk. And these are some of the topics that we talked about. But you can see we talked to different kinds of people. Here's a few key things that we found out. Not everything, but just a few key things. One was about respecting and honoring animals. This wasn't just like slaughter the animals, eat them. They're just there for the taking. There's a lot of harmony and spiritual expression involved in the harvesting of animals. You do not waste food. Food is something you enjoy with the family and in the community, and especially when you're getting country food. That's the word they use for harvested food. As the country food versus store-bought food is really important. Country food is something you eat as part of a family. It's something you eat together. It's important that you eat it together. Food sharing was another hugely important theme, really deeply held traditional value. There were many forms of food sharing. Traditional sharing of country foods, like even a seal different parts would go to different family members. Communal responsibility for supplying those country foods to those in need, like especially elders or single parents who couldn't go out hunting. You could ask for it, or you could exchange it. Maybe you could buy it from somebody if they were willing to sell it to you. What I want to emphasize then, in addition to the formative work, was we did community workshops. And I'm going to show you some scenes of the community workshops in action. And each of these is a slide of a community workshop in a different community. But you can see, well, here I am, a little bit younger those days. But generally people would be sitting in a circle And the first thing you would do is everyone gets the chance to tell their story. This was so important. Very little guideline. It was really important to let people share freely their what they think was important, what's going on, what they wanted to say. Some people would only talk for a minute. Some people would talk for 10, 15 minutes or longer. You had to give them that space to talk. And there was no guidance, nothing like, now tell me about the causes of diabetes. No, nothing like that. It was what they wanted to talk about, what they felt was important. While they were talking, we were writing down, well, we were recording, but we were also writing down on flip charts around the room and posting around the room. So what they could see is what they were saying, their ideas were valuable because we were writing them down. And so someone would be busy scribbling away on the flip chart, writing down their ideas and putting them up on charts, and they would be stuck. So by the end of of any of the community workshops, there would be the wall would be wallpapered with flip chart pages. The next thing we would do is we brainstormed a list of problem foods. And I want to point out something that in her ear, she has a translation device. And so there was somebody in a booth and he was translating the English into Inuktitut, and he was translating the Inuktitut into English. And so whenever someone would mention a food, it would be written in English and in Inuktitut. And so there was a free list, a brainstorming of problem foods that everybody got 20 sticky dots, and they would vote for the top problem foods. And this is a compilation of the list. Pop. Pop is their term for soda pop, like Coca-Cola. Pop, pop. This one community didn't have pop at the top, but put sugar. This is based on a ranking of the foods that contributed the most um, calories or to the diet, and sweetened drinks in from dietary recall. So you put all this together, and it was really clear that they wanted us to work on pop, number one. Next was chips, by which we mean potato chips, not French fries. Then sugar, then sweetened drinks, then candy. So this is an example of the community deciding what your intervention program should look like. I think this is the main thing that I want to emphasize here, is they decided what foods should be dealt with, what should be the priority. And there was some attention paid to the foods that they ate as well as what they said in the community workshops. The next thing they would do is we took the top most mentioned items, like pop in this example, and went through the process again, and they brainstormed what would be some healthier options for pop. And they said, well, there's diet pop, there's Kool-Aid jammers, there's juice. Now, you might say Kool-Aid jammers, I don't know if you even know what that is. That Kool-Aid is like a sugary drink that comes in a mix. Kool-Aid jammers is by no means a healthy thing, but someone mentioned it, and it's important in brainstorming that you don't squelch anybody's ideas. You let everybody freely talk, because then what happens is then there's a voting, and Kool-Aid jammers got no votes, right? So this is an example of what did get the votes. And if you put this across all of the different communities, water got the most votes, then diet pop, then Crystal Light, which is a kind of sugar-free, artificially sweetened flavored powder, and then fruit juice. And so they decided what foods should be promoted as part of the intervention. So what foods should be dispromoted and what foods should be promoted. Then we did the same thing on behaviors to promote. And this is what was chosen. Healthier cooking methods at home should be emphasized most votes. Eating together as a family, cooking meals at home, second most votes. Use a shopping list, plan with a menu or a budget, next 21 votes, so forth and so on. So what you can see is, again, they're deciding what behaviors should be promoted as part of the intervention. And developing messages. I'm wearing the same shirt. Shirt. Same process for deciding on the messages. And other steps, we continued with this process. In fact, these workshops took a couple of days. They were very intensive, and we had to cater them. So it was not an inexpensive thing, but it was definitely worthwhile. And this is the program that was developed, Healthy Foods North, that was conducted in Inuit communities. It was in a series of phases. It emphasized different foods with different kinds of physical activity uh, um, aspects. And these are some of the promotional materials. There was a role model family that appeared in many of the materials, right, developed by artists. And um, this idea of the family eating together, eating traditional foods, eating country foods together, as you recall, was so important. This family motif appeared in visual materials, and there were radio like radio scripts, like radio stories. These are an emphasis on country foods. These are some of the materials that emphasize country foods. This is how people eat country foods. It's typically eaten raw, on cardboard dipped into mayonnaise or with soy sauce. So you'll have whale blubber eaten raw, and or caribou or frozen muskox or something like that eaten raw. And that's something sort of comparative nutritional information of those foods versus regular Western foods. So in summary, um, here I go again. All public health programs take place in communities of people. And they have their own cultural values and perspectives based on those values. And I firmly believe that formative research is greatly necessary to understand these core cultural values. And we have to also put that together with community engagement strategies to be able to develop our programs, our policies, and so forth. I want to thank you for spending some time with me today, and I'm happy to answer any questions, and we can stop. I guess maybe I will stop sharing. There I am. Okay. And so if people who are on the call want to write in their question or any comments that they have, please feel free. And if you write it in Japanese, that's fine, but I'm going to ask Makiko to translate. So I'm happy to answer any questions or respond to any comments. Yes, yes, Doctor.
It's not a core issue, but as for culture, uh, if one person live alone in an isolated island for a long time, still, can we say there is some culture?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, yes, because they have the culture that they grew up with, that they experienced before. They still probably follow that culture, so it's still relevant to them. But of course, they're not getting many opportunities to share their culture or to learn or learn
Mhm.
other cultures, that sort of thing. But yeah, most people, I mean, if it's an adult,
Mhm.
I suppose the other issue might be if it's a baby who hasn't had a chance to be enculturated, then they will not learn the culture. And that's why you have this phenomenon that you sometimes refer to as feral children, or, children who were not raised. I don't even know if that's actually true, or there are many cases of that, but children who were not raised with humans, um, and they didn't develop a culture, right? Because they weren't raised with humans.
But if I say my culture,
Mhm.
you think about culture uh, in which I belong to,
Mhm.
not my own culture.
I do. I also think that any of us probably belongs to multiple cultures, right? And so none of us belongs. I mean, it's like, am I American? Yes, I guess I am. I belong to that culture, but I'm not like many other Americans, right? I mean, I have mixed heritage myself, and I grew up in a very different set of subcultures within the United States. So I'm exposed to many different kinds of culture. Hello, healthcare.
Okay. Mhm.
So I'm happy to answer any other questions that people might have.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you for your wonderful presentation. I totally understand how to consider the different culture for conducting the research and the effective intervention. But uh, is there a common similar cultural value you found, or each culture is different?
Well, so what you're asking is, are there universals? Like, are
Yes.
there universal cultural rules and that sort of thing? There's a big debate about this, right, in the literature about whether such things exist. Um, uh, Typically, they would say that one type of universal cultural rule is about incest. Like having romantic relationships between father, daughter, mother, son. That's typically thought to be a universal cultural rule. But there's also tremendous variability, and I think the difference is I'm not sure that it's worth looking into trying to decide whether there are universal cultural rules. I would rather understand that variability that exists and try to develop programs and policies that meet the cultural norms or needs of a particular group or groups of people. I see someone wrote something, it looks like, if you,
I was
oh,
making an
okay.
announcement to the audience.
Okay,
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you so much.
sure. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your presentation. Maybe she wants to go first.
Ma-san, could you
Can
wait?
you hear me?
It's good.
Can you
Yes.
hear me? Hello?
We hear you. Go ahead.
Okay. Okay. Hello, Dr. Gittelsohn. Thank you very much for your wonderful lecture. And yeah, it's very fascinating for us to have the time to think about nutrition. Yeah. And the importance of culture and people's, perceptions and their behaviors. Yeah. And the one point, yeah, you've done a lot of research programs, to engage communities to change people's behaviors. That is very important. And also I think in the United States, maybe a lot of us have realized that the food industry, usually we are not like farmers. We can plan if we want to eat something, we can plan and we eat, but now we can only eat what are provided, right? So yeah, so like the food industries, if they make lots of high sugar drinks and high calorie foods, and so consumers will buy that because that's what we have in the store. Yeah, and also the organic, like healthy food is very expensive. Like besides your research approach in the community, would you consider research approaches to affect to have impact the industry, food industry?
Sure. Well, I will have to say that most of my work has been community-based, and not worked at the level of food manufacturers. I will say that over the years, I've gone increasingly higher macro level. So it started off, households and communities, food stores, city policy, or tribal policy. I've gone that far. Some engagement at federal policy level that I've done, but I haven't yet worked with manufacturers so much. I've worked with producers like farmers, the people who create that apple or that broccoli or whatever. But I do think that there are, of course, a lot of efforts that have taken place in the past to work with manufacturers. This includes product labeling. The whole area of product labeling is one very um, there's a lot of effort that's gone into working with manufacturers to label their products for sugar content or fat or whatever the nutrient is that we're concerned about. So I think that's helpful. Um, when a lot of companies will actually reformulate some of their products when they see that their product gets the warning label, high in sugar or something like that, they'll actually reformulate their products because they don't want that warning label of high in sugar. That's happened in some locations. So there's definitely work that could be done with manufacturers that should be done with manufacturers. And I think they definitely have a role to play in improving the healthiness of the food system that we live in. So yeah, good mention.
Thank you. Thank you for your insight.
Thank you. Sorry, you were going to ask a question.
Okay. So in the process of local intervention, so that your research really goes into the community, like talking to people, interviewing, holding workshop together. So it looks like in those projects, they opened up to you about their dietary habits. And without those communities, I guess research does not have really good outcomes, right? So how do you initially get those, local people involved in your project? And is there any other cases where you really struggle getting into the community and they won't really open up to you?
So the ideal is what happened in Canada in the Arctic. They invited me. Like I've always wanted to go to the Arctic, right? But I had no intention to go to the Arctic and to do a project there. But so I got a phone call from somebody who said, I'm working in the nursing station at Cambridge Bay, and I were really interested in doing, because they had seen that I do health work with food stores, and so that's the ideal. I will say that, yeah, one of the biggest challenges is convincing people to let you do the work. Especially, I would say, store owners. I presented, that we worked with 15 corner stores in Baltimore or something like that. But it probably took us 50 corner stores to ask before we got those 15 who said yes, right? Because a lot of people are very concerned that, this is their means of income for their families. And so they don't want to take any chances. And why should they let some guy from the university come and tell them what to do and so forth? The risk is too big. So a lot of people say no. So this is always a big challenge. And so you get who you get, and it's not clean. But on the other hand, I've also worked in Native American contexts. Sorry. In Native American contexts. And so I don't know if you know this, but in the United States, there's over 500 federally recognized Native American tribes. And they are sovereign nations. So even though their land area may be relatively small, some of them have huge land area, but some pretty small, they are sovereign. They are in charge, authoritative within their community. They decide what happens in their community. Now, so if you can convince the tribal government to allow this program or project to happen, then you have that support, and it will happen. If you can't convince them, forget it. Nothing will ever happen. You might as well just forget it. So there are communities where you can work with different gatekeepers and so forth, and that becomes a very important part of the picture. So I'm not sure there's any magic to it. A large part of it is relationship building, reputational. So I've been doing food store based stuff for 15 years before I got a call from the Canadian Arctic, right? Otherwise, if I hadn't been doing it, I don't think I would have gotten the call, right? Because they wouldn't have known to call me. Thank you. So there was somebody else who started to ask a question.
Before that, can I take a question from our fellow online?
Here's somebody, Tanaka.
Tanaka-san?
Yes, yes, thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, thank you. So I have two questions. Yeah, and one is firstly, thank you very much for your very insightful and comprehensive lecture. So my name is Tanaka, and since I worked for JICA, Japan International Cooperation Agency in developing countries, your lecture was very interesting for me. And I have two questions. So one is, how do you design an intervention when the community doesn't perceive an issue as a problem, but from a medical perspective, it needs intervention? So sometimes I face this situation. So I want, if you have experience.
Sure. Well, that's very similar to the example that I gave about how we're working on obesity in Native Americans, but they're not interested in that. But what they are interested in is diabetes. So you frequently have to say you're working about A when you're actually working on B or B and A, or you're framing it in a different way. So for example, I worked on a large project which was about obesity prevention in Native American schools for children. And nobody was interested in us talking about obesity prevention. This was just not an issue or concern. So the project was framed entirely about improving the health to live a long life. All of those sorts of concerns for children to, maybe even to help with academic performance. Those were some of the rationale that was given. So you need to figure out what are the salient issues that are motivating for people, and don't lie, but emphasize that you're working on those things that are important. So figure out what's important to them and focus on those.
Okay, thank you very much. And one more question in general. So in your experience, what is the most common mistake people make when doing formative research for nutrition intervention? So it's very in general topic, but
So one of the big mistakes that I've seen is they do too fast. They do it like, okay, you've got a week. Go do it in a week. And the problem is you're just getting started after a week for any kind of figuring out what's going on. Generally speaking, we're talking about a month or two to do a decent piece of formative research. Now, I will say that there are some existing guides for doing formative research to help you speed through it. These are called RAPS, so Rapid Assessment Procedures, or FES, Focused Ethnographic Studies. And these are kind of like cookbooks. So there's a FES for acute respiratory infections. There's a RAP for infant and young child feeding. There's a RAP for diarrheal disease. So there are existing formative research guidebooks that have been developed for specific types of health. There's a women's health RAP. So for specific kinds of problems. And so that is one way to help speed it up. But a week or two is just not sufficient. And I would say that's one of the main challenges I've seen is, and it's happened to me before, you've got 2 weeks here, that's all we can afford, go. And you work really hard and then you feel like, you just didn't get enough done. But that's one of the main challenges.
okay, thank you very much. So I'm thinking I want to go to US graduate school, but I'm worried about the length of stay. I mean the period for studying. Usually, as foreigner, we will stay maybe 1 year or 2 years, right? So during 2 years, can we finish from formative research to the dissertation, or it's difficult for master degree or a master degree candidate students to complete all of the process?
So so you're asking the right person. So I actually am on the MPH admissions committee for
Okay.
my school of public health. And
Okay, so
I advise doctoral students and have sat with it. You're talking about a master's program.
yeah. I think for doctor it's possible, right?
Yeah, doctoral degree, it's very possible. For a master's degree, it's possible because there is the 1 year in-person master's. That was the traditional MPH. I'm talking about my university, so Johns Hopkins School of Public Health. That was the traditional degree, and it's still very popular. Probably we get about 250 to 300 students who do the in-person 1 year MPH every year. But we now have a distance MPH, which is a part-time MPH, which takes over the course of at least two, more likely 2.5 or 3 or even more years. It takes as long as it takes, but probably more common is 2.5 to 3 years. And that provides a lot of opportunity to you just have more time because because it's a distance program, they know you've got a day job that you're working your regular job during the day and you're attending classes at night or and you're I think they require you to show up briefly for a few weeks every year or something like that. But it's really intended for a busy professional who wants to get an MPH degree. And it's going to take you much longer to do it, but that's because you're typically only taking 1 or 2 courses per term. But that's the way it goes.
Okay. Thank you very much. Yeah, yeah.
I see there's a question in the
Yes, in the chat box.
wow, it's a long question. Thank you for your meaningful lecture. I am Mai Kuraki, who is doing my fellowship at UNAIDS in Eswatini. I don't know where that is. Eswatini. I try to make some proposals related to HIV, but I'm struggling with understanding the problems and backgrounds here because there's a lot of problems which are not written in their policy and strategic documents. Is there any advice, tips to problems in their culture in order to propose community-based project overseas? 2, in terms of understanding the culture and the problem, local experts are more knowledgeable than international. What is the value of international experts? Since I can idea, I've been wondering that value. Okay. So, he respelled S1. So first of all, if you're interested in HIV/AIDS, there is a focused ethnographic study cookbook for that topic. So that's one of the very first places that I would look. And it may be that if you read that, it may be something that it's not just do this, but it's also some methods for analysis. And it may provide sufficient guidance. I haven't looked at that particular one in about 20 years, 15 years, but it may provide sufficient guidance for you to be able to, do it yourself or with assistance or something like that. You may not need that international expert. Or maybe the international expert could provide advice from over Zoom, like they don't, because it can be very expensive to bring somebody to a international setting and have him or her live there for 2 months or whatever. Maybe they could support you or your other team members remotely, or maybe they just come for like a week at the beginning and a week at the end or something. I don't know. There's lots of different ways that could be done that could potentially save money. Hope that's helpful.
Thank you for your wonderful lecture. And I have read some of your articles, and I felt that you have emphasized environmental interventions in your work rather than individual level nutrition education. So how did your experiences shape this perspective?
That's a great question. So I can tell you exactly what happened. So I mentioned earlier that one of the first projects I worked on was a school-based obesity prevention program for Native American children. It was a huge project, many millions of US dollars spent. 9 years of formative research. Well, first 2 years was formative research, intervention development. Then there was the program. The program was state-of-the-art for a school-based program. There was a culturally appropriate curriculum for 3rd graders, 4th graders, and 5th graders. There was culturally appropriate PE classes. There was work with food service. There was a family component to it. It was beautiful. Spent 9 years of my life, no impact on childhood obesity. It had some impact on diet, but didn't impact childhood obesity. And I was left very depressed. Can you imagine if you work so hard on a product for 9 years? That's a long time. And to not see any meaningful impact. And what I realized, in my opinion at least, was that we did a lot of great stuff inside of schools, but you know what? The kids just left the schools, went home, out into the community, ate whatever they ate with their families, ate at the fast food restaurants, watched TV, whatever they were doing outside. So we were only affecting part of the situation. We weren't affecting the entirety of it. There is another study called Shape Up Somerville, led by Christina Economos at Tufts University. She's now like the dean. But that was a project which worked with children at all times, not just during school hours, but before and after school and in many community settings. And that was successful in reducing obesity in children. So my point, though, is that in my own personal evolution, I began, after that experience working with a basically failed school program, I began working in community settings outside of schools. And that's how it evolved, that I first started working in corner stores and recreation centers and sometimes in corner stores and schools. It's not that I think schools are bad. I think schools are great. I think you should work in schools, but not just schools. I think you should work in other settings as well. So gradually my work evolved from being school-centric to being multi-venue, multi-institutional types of interventions. And it continues to change. There are problems with multi-institutional complex interventions, they're really complex and they're expensive and time consuming. And it takes a lot of skill sets to be able to implement a workplace intervention alongside a school-based intervention, alongside a food store intervention. And very few people have that kind of experience to do that, or can get the funding to do that, because we're talking about multi-millions of dollars to do that. So I've begun exploring digital strategies as a means of improving reach and potentially sustainability. But that's a different presentation. The next time I come back, I'll talk about that.
Yeah. Okay, so it's the time for this lecture. Also, is there anyone else from the floor for more questions? Okay.
Yes.
One last question.
Thank you for your lecture. As I work as a home care nurse, I saw many disparities in even in Japanese regions. So I wonder. So I have two questions. First, I wonder if there is any studies conducted in Japan, like such a interventional studies. And secondly, what do you think is the difficulties if you conduct such formative researches in Japan?
So I'm not up on the Japanese public health interventional literature to be able to say whether there are any studies like what I've described in Japan or not. My guess is that there's some. My guess is that there's been some schools, probably somewhat similar to the American experience. There have been some school-based trials and these sorts of things. I have no idea if they've been successful or not, or what made them successful or not. So I think you need to do a little bit of literature review to answer that question. And sorry, what was the second part of your question?
So what do you think is the difficulties when conducting such formative researches in Japan?
Well, one big problem, I already mentioned one, which is the experience level needed to do this, because well, if we're talking about formative research, then you need somebody who's trained in mixed methods, typically, and is trained in the methodologies associated with the topical area. So if it's a topical area related to food and nutrition, then probably some nutrition background is helpful. But mixed methods meaning qualitative and quantitative. So finding that expertise can be challenging to find. The other challenges relate to things like funding. I mean, can you get funding to do this work? Now, I will say that it doesn't have to be super expensive, but I don't know what would be considered expensive or not. I mean, to do formative work, if someone said, I want to work with, like you mentioned, you work with seniors. So, if I were to say I'd like to try to improve the food environment for seniors, I would say, yes, that's a great idea. Let's do some formative research on the food environment of seniors. I would probably say, well, let's start off with 40 seniors, of which I don't know if there's a rural difference versus an urban difference. So maybe it's half rural, half urban. I'd say some some food secure by some measure that you have that for that. And I would stratify them by some criteria. And then I would interview and observe what's going on in those households and try to understand what the situation is. And then probably that's the phase one of the formative research. Then I would probably have some idea of how to proceed with intervention. And I'd probably do some additional idea generation and follow up with some of those ideas, again, with a sample of people, maybe a different group of people. Maybe seniors, but maybe other people, maybe their family members, maybe people who serve those seniors. Well, people like yourself who are caregivers for those seniors would probably be somebody that I would probably talk to about that. So there definitely would be a path forward to doing the formative work. I don't think it would have to be super expensive. I think it could be a decent master's thesis. It would be a good master's thesis for that topic. By the way, before I forget, I'm happy to talk to some of you who are interested in studying at Hopkins because I remember at least one or two of you said that you wanted to do your master's and maybe a doctoral degree at Hopkins. So I'm happy to talk to you about those possibilities.
Thank you very much. So this is it for tonight's lecture. Please give Professor Joel a big applause. Thank you very much. Okay, thank you very much. Have a good night.
Bye bye.